Welcome to the Curtis R. Priam Experimental Media and Performing Arts Center for the 10th Annual President's Commencement Colloquy. Guests are reminded to silence their communications devices. Wireless access is available through the RPI Public Access Point. Please welcome to the stage William Walker, Vice President for Strategic Communications and External Relations.
Good afternoon. I'm Bill Walker, Vice President for Strategic Communications and External Relations, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the 10th Annual President's Commencement Colloquy. The Commencement Colloquy was established by President Jackson to provide a forum for the Rensselaer community to gather on the eve of commencement for a dialogue with our honorands. Please join me in welcoming the host of today's colloquy, the 18th President of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson.
Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. It is with great pride and pleasure that I welcome our 2012 graduates who are in the audience, and we welcome their families. And we welcome their families, friends, and all members of the Rensselaer family, our larger community, and all of you who are here today. It also is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome our 2012 honorary degree candidates and their guests to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and to the 10th Annual President's Commencement Colloquy. The colloquy now is a firmly rooted tradition at this important time of transition in the Rensselaer academic calendar. And we thank all of you for taking the time to join us. This year, we are privileged to be honoring leaders from each branch of the U.S. government, the executive, legislative, and judicial, along with pioneers in the technology and academic sectors. Our 2012 honorands exemplify that cross-section of government, business, and academic leadership and achievement that come to the fore in responding to and shaping our changing world. As our conversation this afternoon progresses, you will learn more about each of them, but let me begin by welcoming a member of the Rensselaer Hall of Fame and the Inventors Hall of Fame, recipient of the highest honor for engineering achievement bestowed by Rensselaer, the Davies Medal, and the recipient of the highest honor for technological achievement bestowed by the President of the United States, the National Medal of Technology and Innovation. A pioneer in his field, he holds numerous patents. In fact, reach into your pockets. I won't say take out your phones, but you can take a picture with the device he created, the inventor of the digital camera and related imaging technologies that transformed the industry in our world, now retired from the Eastman Kodak Company, Rensselaer's own Mr. Stephen Sasson. Pioneer in artificial intelligence and complex systems, author, teacher, innovator, entrepreneur, and eclipse chaser. He is a member of the Hall of Fellows of the Computer History Museum and recipient of numerous other prestigious awards, including the highest honor given to civilians by the military, the Decoration for Exceptional Civilian Service for his transformational work as Chief Scientist of the U.S. Air Force. Considered the father of expert systems, his work resulted in a fundamental shift in the framework of artificial intelligence science, for which he was awarded what is called the Nobel Prize of Computing, the Association for Computing Machinery's Turing Award. Excuse me. He has authored or co-authored the books on artificial intelligence. The Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, in fact, awards a prize in his name for outstanding artificial intelligence research. He is witness to and shaper of computing history. Please join me in welcoming the Kumagai Professor of Computer Science Emeritus at Stanford University, Dr. Edward Feigenbaum. Our next honorand has been at the forefront of some of the most critical public policy issues of our time. A leader in United States science, technology, energy, and health policy, he served in the U.S. Congress for 26 years, representing his Tennessee constituents and those of us who care about scientific discovery and technological innovation. As chairman of the House Committee on Science and Technology, he helped to build the bipartisan coalition required to enact the critical America Competes Act and more than 150 other legislative initiatives. A senior member of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, a champion of the U.S. space program, an advocate for expanding the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics workforce, and the fastest runner in the Congress for 20 years in a row. And you could ask him why he was running all the time. Currently a partner in the law firm K&L Gates, please join me in welcoming the Honorable Bart Gordon. Our fourth honorand is a distinguished scientist and co-recipient of the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1997 for development of methods to cool and trap atoms with laser light. Born to parents who emigrated from China in the 1940s to study, education has been fundamental to his family and his life. But from an early age, his education branched out beyond books as he built model airplanes, used lunch money to buy ingredients to build homemade rockets. And in an early display of entrepreneurship, he turned his chemistry hobby into a business, testing neighbors' soil for acidity and missing nutrients. Now, his education, mixed with his inherent curiosity, led him to teaching and research positions at the University of California, Berkeley, Stanford University, and AT&T Bell Labs. As director of the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, he began to focus intensively on energy and climate change. In 2009, President Barack Obama coaxed him out of the lab and into the fray, nominating him to be the United States Secretary of Energy. And today he is at the forefront of the effort to innovate our way to global energy security and sustainability. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Please join me in welcoming the United States Secretary of Energy, the Honorable Stephen Chu. Now, we're all very powerful, but we don't control the weather or the mechanical state of airplanes. And so we know that Justice Scalia will be here shortly, but we will begin our conversation. And then we will pause when he arrives, and then we will continue our conversation. Thank you. We live in interesting times. We face enormous global economic and geopolitical uncertainties. In fact, the clock is ticking on finding solutions to many of our great challenges, including energy and energy security, climate, water, healthcare, and our overall security. But as we know, in challenge, there's opportunity. The question is how best to tap that opportunity in the face of myriad barriers to change. Scientific discovery and technological innovation will be fundamental to the solutions to these great questions. It will require big ideas, transformative ideas, disruptive ideas. And it will require collaboration across disciplines and sectors. And today, we are honored to be joined by 5 people who have made decisions, discoveries, and innovations that have resulted in fundamental shifts in the way the world functions. So we look to them for wisdom and for example. So Secretary Chu, Steve, you have been quoted as saying that beginning with winning the Nobel Prize in 1999, and more so now that you are Secretary of Energy, that you went, and I quote, from being just a scientist doing his own thing to being looked upon as a representative of science. We think that is a quote. Now, the work of a research scientist is much different in some ways than the work of a national and global public policy maker and leader. You successfully operate in the upper echelons of both worlds. So could you just begin by talking to us a bit about the transition from the lab to the limelight? You know, what were some of the things that surprised you? What skills did you require? And what are some lessons learned for future scientists and engineers as we work to encourage them to get involved in public policy? You know, you have the unique distinction of being the first Nobel Prize winner in a major cabinet post. So tell me, when you were doing research at Stanford, you know, at Bell Labs or at LBL, did you ever expect to end up on The Daily Show talking climate change with Jon Stewart?
I have to say no, because I never heard of The Daily Show until they asked me to go on it. And I said, what's this about? So, but seriously, that's true. But seriously, I think I was raised by my parents to believe that the highest level you can possibly achieve is to be a scholar at a great university and to do teaching research. And I have to say, after all these years, they were right. It's been downhill ever since. But also, to your point, it is very important that scientists are willing to step forward and serve the public. And this is truly a service job, because we do need more voices in the government at the highest levels that can actually say that these are the facts as we know them, these are the things you should think about, and that should be an integral part of the policy dialogue, because the country, the people are making decisions based on, and these are decisions that are deeply rooted in technology. So I think it's very important to do that. My only thing about how to deal, you asked me what was the big surprise. There are 2 surprises. One's a very good news story. That is, I found a number of people in public service, both elected representatives, people like Bart Gordon, but also people who are career people within agencies, including the Department of Energy, that were truly outstanding. They easily could have done much better, but they felt there was a mission, and they had to do, and they felt strongly that being in the government and working on these things mattered more than doubling your salary or tripling your salary. And this speaks volumes so that was a very pleasant surprise. There were other surprises. I didn't realize quite what some of the theater was as you go before in the public, but that's okay. The real important part is that there are Americans who are willing to step forward, and despite all that I say about going downhill ever since leaving a job at a professor at a great school like Stanford, it's that it was able to leverage something I deeply cared about and to get other people excited about it, and also trying to convince some of my closest friends to come forward and also serve in that respect. And so, in that sense, I don't regret it.
Well, thank you. Congressman Gordon Barton, in 1824, Stephen Van Rensselaer established this institute for the purpose, and I'm quoting, of instructing persons in the application of science to the common purposes of life. In fact, in the founding document, he wrote of, and I quote again, instructing the sons and daughters of farmers and mechanics. Now, you are the son and grandson of a farmer, and you have devoted much energy in the Congress to enabling the application of science to the common purposes of life, our true common purposes. And in doing so, you often tell the story of your father with an agriculture degree being hired as a teacher at a local high school. He was assigned to teach science and to coach girls basketball. Now, of that you said, I'm quoting, "I'm not sure what he knew the least about." Now, I'm sure he knew more than we think he knew. Now, in advocating for the America Competes Act, you have noted the importance of STEM education and research in driving innovation in the U.S. So talk to us about that and how your early experiences motivated you to focus in this arena.
Oh, thank you, President Jackson. Let me first make a quick...
Please call me Shirley.
Sure. Let me make a quick footnote on Secretary Chu's comments. One thing that I have observed, and having observed the administrations for 26 years, is there's uniqueness now in the federal science research enterprise, in that when you have someone of Steve Chu's caliber and John Holdren and the others, they had met each other at conferences and workshops and a variety of things before. And so in the federal government, there are just so many silos. It's just so hard to get things done that I've been able to see these intellectuals who had a previous introduction and then also have an appreciation for, as he said, for the facts, really I think has been a unique opportunity for us. And so even though you hear about a lot of dysfunctional, and there is, at least within this area, I've been very pleased. Back to your question. My father knew a lot about a lot of things. I was kidding, but he didn't know much about coaching girls basketball, though, I will say that. But he was the last one hired. And so at that time, if you were the last one hired, you had to coach the girls basketball. And you had to teach science. That really is something, my 11-year-old daughter interviewed me. She had an assignment. She had to interview someone and then write a story about it. And she interviewed me last week and said, you know, what are you most proud of in your time in Congress? And I told her the American Competes Act. And the quick history of that, when it'll get to your answer here, was that in 2007, I joined 3 others in a bipartisan, bicameral letter to the National Academies asking them to put together a committee and make recommendations on the competitiveness of America in the 21st century. They put together a stellar group, 2 of which are here at this podium, Steve Chu and Shirley Jackson, as well as folks from the business community. They made a variety of recommendations. It was a very sobering report and demonstrated how the United States was really stagnant in terms of our federal investment in R&D, and we were actually moving downward in our private sector, where other countries were investing a lot more. And they also brought up the human capital aspect of it. And that is, at that time, there was something like 58% of the middle school teachers of math had neither a degree or a certification to teach math. 80-something% of the physical science teachers. And so that was one of the reasons that we score so poorly in those areas. And so clearly, if we're going to raise those scores, you have to have teachers who not only are good teachers, but know their content. And I'm not talking about just having a few smart folks like are on the other side of the table here. The idea, you know, if you invent the digital camera, you still have to have someone on the line that has the ability, whether it's a high school or junior college ability with background in those areas, to be able to perform whatever the manufacturing aspect of it. And so a part of what we did is create a program where we provided scholarships and stipends for those students that would go into math or science and education and agree to teach for 5 years. And the teaching for 5 years was important because half of our teachers leave the profession after the first 3 years. We also wanted to get smart people, like over here on the other side of the aisle, that wanted to teach later, to be able to fast track them in and setting up programs for that. Interestingly, the chairman of that committee, Norm Augustine, who has advanced degrees in engineering and was president and CEO of Lockheed Martin, wanted to teach high school math. And so he quit his job as CEO of Lockheed Martin so he could teach high school math. Well, no school would hire him because he didn't have his education degree. And so he had to go to Princeton, and he taught there instead. So we're trying to find ways through that. So getting back to your original question I think it's very important for schools like this to be able to help with that content. We also put incentives for women and minorities who are so underrepresented to bring them up too. So I hope I got to your question there.
Well, thank you. Our fifth honorand has arrived. Let me introduce him to you. In a 2005 study, our final honorary degree recipient was crowned the quote-unquote funniest justice, having drawn the most laughs during the oral arguments before the United States Supreme Court during the time period under review. And in fact, those findings were corroborated in a more extensive study published in the Communication Law Review in 2011. I kid you not. Now, the truth of the matter is that because of the rigor with which he applies his judicial philosophy, he's also known as one who makes others sharpen their arguments. But perhaps born to be on stage, he played the piano at an earlier age, and more recently stole the show at the Washington National Opera. And he says he aspires to become a concert violinist, or perhaps a tenor. Who knew? His work experience spans the private, academic, and public sectors. He practiced law in Cleveland, Ohio, taught law at the universities of Virginia and Chicago, and applied the law working in the administrations of President Nixon, in the Office of Telecommunications Policy, and President Ford in the U.S. Department of Justice. In 1982, President Reagan appointed him to the U.S. Court of Appeals. And in 1986, President Reagan nominated him for a seat on the United States Supreme Court, and he was confirmed unanimously by the U.S. Senate. So please join me in welcoming to the stage the longest current sitting member, Associate Justice, United States Supreme Court, the Honorable Antonin Scalia. Nice to meet you.
I'm sorry to be so late.
You know what? I'm just delighted you came.
Well, I made it. My luggage didn't, but we're hoping that'll get here.
Okay,
too.
let's take a quick picture.
Oh, okay.
Here. Thank you.
It's you. I have Bart Gordon.
Now, we were just beginning to get to know each other a little bit, Justice Scalia.
Yeah, I didn't want to make an entrance. My plane was late.
That's all right. You always make an entrance, and so this is fine. Now, here we are at Rensselaer, the oldest technological university in the United States, steeped in the history of an institution whose students, faculty, alumni, and alumnae have helped to shape the world. But it is a world that is fundamentally different than when the Constitution, as you know, was originally drafted. thanks to scientific discoveries and technological innovations, some of which the folks here have driven, that never could have been imagined at that time, which brings me to you. And you are a self-described originalist, interpreting the U.S. Constitution by beginning with the text and giving the text the meaning that it bore when it was adopted. Now, before I ask you the hard question, do you like being an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court?
I'm doing it for the money. Actually, I could have retired, I think, 8 or 10 years ago, I guess, at full salary. And I'm probably too stupid to have this job. But, I love what I do. I can't imagine what I would do that would give me as much satisfaction as trying to figure out legal problems in a position where it makes a big difference. So,
well, we're delighted to have you here. But let's go back, because we had said that we wanted to try to get people to understand the justice's judicial philosophy. You've spoken of an enduring constitution, and it's against that constitution that U.S. Supreme Court decisions are made. So how do Supreme Court decisions, in your view, help to create an enduring framework against which society can and does evolve? And how does your originalist philosophy permit that evolution?
well, a constitution is not for evolving. All you need to evolve is a legislature and a ballot box. A constitution is and has always been an impediment to change, not the motor of change. And when one interprets it in such a way that it changes, you establish impediments to change which the American people never agreed to. I mean, there are certain unalienable rights set forth in the Constitution which the people, by their legislation, cannot change. When you read new ones in, you reduce the scope of that democratic choice, and thereby do not produce evolution. You produce an evolution in the meaning of the Constitution, but you don't produce an evolution in the society. You rigidify the society, and those people who want to use the Constitution as the instrument of change want to use it precisely because it rigidifies, because it makes the rules that it imposes binding from coast to coast and now and forever. That's not really evolution. I mean, it's sort of an evolution into an inability to evolve.
Okay. We'll come back to that.
Think about that for a while.
Now, in an interview for the Computer History Museum, Dr. Feigenbaum, you tell of working with a geneticist and a chemist on a problem, and in doing so, inventing knowledge engineering as we were going along. Now, you say that the big idea, your aha moment, was the awareness that in the knowledge lies the power. And indeed, that realization and its implications fundamentally shifted the direction and trajectory of artificial intelligence research. Tell us what brought you to that moment, the significance of the interdisciplinary team, and the shift that resulted from your articulation of what came to be known as the knowledge principle.
President Jackson, I'll answer your question, but I wanted to do what Mr. Gordon did and comment briefly on what Steve Chu said, because you mentioned my service in Washington, and you asked him what his surprises were. I keep thinking of my service was in the Pentagon when the Secretary of Defense was Bill Perry, another Stanford professor. And Bill Perry used to start off some of his speeches by saying he wanted to tell you about Washington, D.C. and the national capital area 20 square miles surrounded by reality. But when you asked me to tell you how I got to that point, I can give you a very brief personal sketch of how I got to that point, and then I can give you the, what you might call the scientific sketch of how I got to that point. I was an engineering student at Carnegie Tech before it was called Carnegie Mellon, and I just decided to look around and see what was broader than engineering. And I stumbled on what was essentially a school of behavioral science, although it was called the Graduate School of Industrial Administration. And there I came in contact with one of the really true geniuses of the 20th century, Herbert Simon, and later winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, but also one of the co-inventors of artificial intelligence. And so that brought me into the field. I taught at Berkeley for a while. Artificial intelligence was conceived as a study of the information processes that make up what we call the mind, not the brain. It has nothing to do with brains. And there started from the very beginning two branches. One you might call psychology, because if you want to invent a mind, you can do it with observation, because we have billions of them around us. So observe very carefully and then build models. And the other branch was the branch that dealt with engineering. You wanted to build the best possible models, the ones that achieved the most in terms of performance. So the first decade of that field, people were happened to end up focusing on the issue called generality, which is what is it that allows the intelligent individual to change his or her attention from problem to problem and solve problems in many areas over the span of, not moment by moment, but over the span of hours, days, weeks, and so on. I began this collaboration with Joshua Lederberg in the genetics department at Stanford, another Nobel Prize winner, on the whole issue of what are the processes of intelligence that go into forming hypotheses and constructing scientific theories. And he enlisted the collaboration of another wonderful Stanford professor, Carl Djerassi, the inventor of the birth control pill, who was head of the Stanford Mass Spectrometry Laboratory. And we began a series of experiments that, to use a good science term from your MIT background, except in chemistry, we began titrating knowledge into this system, more and more and more knowledge. And the more knowledge we put in the system, the better became its performance. And so what we came to realize was that the issue was not the generality. The issue in high quality performance was not the generality of the mechanism, but the amount of domain-specific knowledge that the program had of its domain of discourse. And in that first project that you mentioned, we actually achieved the levels of performance of Carl Djerassi and his Ph.D. Postdocs in the laboratory, and went on to do, we ourselves did many others, but then the world did thousands of others, almost all of which corroborated that fundamental insight that in the knowledge lies the power, not in the reasoning. You could put, if you made a little box and stuffed Aristotle in it, that was enough. You didn't need all of 20th century logic to do this reasoning.
So let me ask
anyway, I think that's
interesting. Let me ask Mr. Sasson a question. Now, you graduated from Rensselaer in 1973, And 2 years later, working in the Kodak Apparatus Division Research Lab, you designed and constructed the first digital still camera and playback system. Now, you've said that you were not allowed to discuss that invention or your many other digital-related inventions and innovations that followed for decades. And you've noted that during various portions of that time span, the product, the company, and the country were not ready for your invention. So it is an amazing case study of the emergence of a truly disruptive technology, but in a tradition-bound company. So tell us briefly about those experiences and what, are your observations about disruptive technologies and their acceptance.
Well, I began at Kodak right after I graduated, as you said, and I had this opportunity to do something that I had no business doing. I had no idea how to build this thing. I was just given a very 20-second kind of request to look into charge coupled devices and how we might be able to use them for imaging. And I thought, well, if I could capture a still image, I could at least evaluate it. And then I thought perhaps I could build an entirely portable camera. And then I thought if I could build it with absolutely no moving parts. I was an electrical engineer, so I sort of like that. To try that. But I really had no idea how to go about doing it. So I basically worked with some very talented technicians for about a year and pulled together this entire system, and it worked. And I learned a couple of things right away. One is that when you demonstrate such a system that is taking pictures without film and showing them on an electronic screen without printing on paper, inside a company like Kodak in 1976, you have a couple of things you have to get ready for. And one of those is a lot of questions. I thought people would ask me a lot of questions about the technology, how'd you do this, how'd you make that work? Didn't get any of that. Really, I had to think, but they asked me, when is it going to be ready for prime time? When is it going to be realistic to use this? And why would anybody want to look at their pictures on an electronic screen, And I really had no good answers for that. So I think as a technologist, and if you're working in a disruptive field, you have to think a little bit ahead. And you don't have a lot of data to support a lot of your conclusions. You have intuition. You have some ideas. And so we wrote this in a technical report in 1976, and I sketched out what was called the camera of the future. And I talked about memory cards. I talked about sending them over telephone lines. And I thought, well, this may happen, but I don't know when. And when I was pressed, I came up with about 15 to 20 years, which, when you're in industry, 15 to 20 years is a long time. Most of the people sitting in that conference room are not that concerned about it. And so you have to take a really long view of this and work on the pieces necessary to make it come together. And then you have to realize that your idea of the future is really not the way it's going to turn out, because the rest of the world is inventing along with you. And so such things like the internet and desktop photographic printing and all of those things that I hadn't really thought about, they came together in the 90s. And then all of a sudden we had a viable photographic system which completely displaced the conventional one. So I was pleased to be part of this activity, but many times I was along for the ride as I learned different technologies were being applied. It was a very, very interesting development to watch a very established, a very successful company deal with a disruption that eventually caused quite a bit of change. So fascinating.
Well, it's a classic story of how you have to sometimes go against very powerful institutional forces to bring about change. Now, I have two Steves here, so we agreed informally that I could call them Steve 1 and Steve 2. Okay. The ordering has no significance. So Steve 1, Secretary 2. You've actually dedicated a significant amount of your time and talents to finding the answers to our energy security challenge. And this is, as we know, a high priority for the Obama administration, as it has been, in fact, for previous administrations, both Republican and Democrat. And you've been quoted as saying that solving the world's energy and environment problems will require Nobel-level breakthroughs in key areas. But You know, as you, Bart Gordon and I were talking, we were waiting, you know, we were talking about things like these amazing supplies of natural gas, and a lot of that has come about as a result of technologically being able to get to them. We've talked about the small modular reactor. So is it possible that the answers are out there now, but that they're being held back by powerful institutional forces, be they market forces, regulatory ones, and maybe I'll also try to bring Bart Gordon into this conversation, please.
I think a lot of the answers are out there, but we could have better answers. You know, when I was listening to Steve 2, or Steve 1, talk about Colloquy, I mean, I went to Rochester, I know a little bit, follow a little bit of their history, and that was a very classic case of a disruptive technology was going to interfere with their main line of business, film. And so there was, I'm sure, agony going on as to whether they would embrace the new thing that might kill what really was giving them most of their income. And so we have a similar situation, and I see similar tugs and pulls, and it depends on vision of the CEOs of companies and how they react to that. So your question is very pertinent because, for example, I see renewable energy, particularly wind and solar energy, the prices are coming down. I never would have suspected in the first of the oil shocks in the mid-'70s that these renewables could eventually be as cheap or cheaper, less money, than any new form of energy, including natural gas. In today's, not quite today's prices, let's $4 a million BTU, which is well below the historical average. Wind and solar, we think, will be competitive. Wind within a decade, solar within a decade, decade and a half, without subsidy. And so there's this interesting thing going on of both utility companies, traditional companies, every power generating companies. How do you see your business when this is coming down the road? If I think of publishing companies, they didn't really take on the idea of the internet and publishing and this, and so what happened is it kind of took them by surprise. With energy, it's a little different because it's highly regulated, and so you can actually slow things up, not the way Justice Scalia is talking about, but you can slow up the technology because it is regulated. It's not a greenfield site the way the internet popped into the world. And so I just hope that there are a number of companies that see this as an opportunity. They see what can be happening, what is happening, and that the more progressive leaders of these companies say, okay, we can wish to turn the clock back, but we can also see opportunities of the future and be part of that future. And I think, you know, that boils, and you can take all the energy sectors, you could take energy efficiency, you can do all those things. But having said that, there is still room for much tech. We don't see the end of these developments. And so a lot of the things that science and innovation will come up with will make our choices so much better. And it's not just for energy, it's the way we live, the quality of life, the whole sustainability. Because I will end by saying that we have a world of 7 billion people. This century, we think it's going to go to 9, maybe peak at 9.5 or 10 by the end of the century. And many of those people see the kind of lives that Americans have with all the communication they wanted. But there's no law of physics that says the bulk of all of humanity, of this 10 billion, can actually live in a middle-class world with those things because we do have the technology. So there's no fundamental law that says, nope, we only can have a certain number. And then after we pass this population hump and we go down, then we've got it. So I'm telling myself, we just got to make it through this century, and the rest is downhill.
Now, before I come to Mr. Gordon, Justice Scalia, you look like you had a thought that might have been popping into your head. So let me just kind of slide this question in. You know, the courts really are one of the institutional forces that can expedite or delay action on key cases. And a significant environmental case was the Massachusetts v. EPA case, heard in 2006 and decided in 2007. You dissented in that case. Could you explain that dissent and relate it to the originalist view? Because I think it's, you know, it's an important one from that perspective.
I don't do science, I do law.
Of course.
And
But then what are the challenges?
to understand my position in the case, I'd have to get out the statute and show you the language of the statute. And the issue was simply whether carbon was an environmental pollutant or not. And I did not think that it was ever regarded as that. It is not the Atmospheric Protection Agency, it's the Environmental Protection Agency. And it had always been thought to have authority only to control the environment and not outer space. That was the basis for my dissent. It was not a scientific basis, but simply, as I hope all of my writings on the court are, it was a legal point. And they're usually pretty dull, legal points are.
But that notwithstanding, what would you say are the challenges of the courts, for the courts, in dealing with complex scientific issues, you know, such as global warming, you know, within that kind of a legal or constitutional framework? I mean, you said you're not a scientist.
We don't deal with that stuff.
But the cases come to you.
Well, but they're not put in a scientific framework. They're put in a legal framework. There's always a text which has been adopted by Congress. The areas where we have to figure out science, the major area is patent and copyright, intellectual property, which is the new wealth. And that does require judges to figure out a lot of technological and scientific matters that they have no natural background for. And that's hard. Those cases are very hard. But the other cases, you know, environmental protection, whether we're preserving endangered species, all of that stuff. I don't get into the policy of it. I just get into, here's the text of the statute. Does it allow the agency to do what the agency is now doing? And it's a very humdrum textual exercise, not at all an imaginative science. I'm sorry to tell you that. It's pretty dull stuff. I like it, but
Bart, Congressman Gordon, what do you say about the role of institutional forces in terms of the emergence of disruptive technologies and ideas? You know, you were in the legislative branch. Maybe you could talk a bit about that. Because Congress passes these laws.
Well, I think if you look at some of the agenda you've been talking about, energy, global warming, space exploration, in the time frame that, again, and the circumstances that Secretary Chu pointed out, we can't get from here to there with incremental changes, particularly with the population explosion, which means that we're going to have transformational type disruptive technologies. The difficulties, as was pointed out earlier, is that you're always going to have, and I've certainly seen it from the legislative standpoint, a parochial interest that are going to want to stop that because they like the way things are. Quite frankly, I think the quarterly reports in corporate America now are a problem because any CEO will tell you that if they can't turn a profit in 2 or 3 years on investment, they're not going to make that type of investment. So that once again puts you into an incremental type of situation. You compound that with other countries around the world whose part of their country business plan is bringing forth new industries. It really puts us in a very difficult situation. And so I think that really is, it's that there's a federal role here to be a pull. Well, I guess a push and a pull, a federal role for a push in terms of investment into R&D that's not going to be done, elsewhere. And to some extent, a pull in this, whether it is Department of Defense taking products out of DARPA, or whether it is tax policy or other policies that allow, at one time oil was a new type of energy, and it was given tax benefits to help it move along. So I think clearly it's mature now, but we're going to have to, I think, the federal role is to help push and pull when you look at it in context to what's going on around the rest of the world.
Sometimes the institutional forces actually involve people. And when a new technology is introduced into the workplace, people often feel threatened. They could feel threatened because they feel it threatens the business model. But they can also feel threatened because they may feel their careers may be on the line. And so if you talk about expert systems, for instance, Dr. Feigenbaum, people may even feel their identities at risk. So how do you both help people to use the technology and to shepherd them through the cultural change that its introduction brings? And I'm sure you face some of that in many arenas, but particularly as your role as Chief Scientist of the Air Force.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very, very interesting question. Maybe I should address the Air Force part of it first and the expert system part of it second.
Okay, but if you could bring them together real quick.
I will. There was a very great resistance over a period of about 15 years from the top of the Air Force to the introduction of what were called remotely piloted vehicles, RPV, now called drones. By now, the drone technology is fully accepted by the Air Force, and fairly recently, the number of pilots graduated by the Air Force who were drone pilots with wings and everything exceeded the number of pilots who were jet pilots for the first time. But that transition needed to be hastened by, first of all, it was DARPA who developed the first two Predators, and it was DOD and Bill Perry who insisted that those two DARPA prototypes be sent over to Bosnia and be put to work. And one of them crashed, and the Air Force was blamed for that. Of course, it had nothing to do with it. The second one, the Air Force was pushed along by the CIA, which put a weapon on it. And now the Air Force couldn't say these things were only for reconnaissance. And so the Air Force finally came to believe in this area of robotics technology. Space exploration was mentioned, and there again we have a big problem with, in my view, with NASA, who thinks of space exploration as a human endeavor rather than a human endeavor assisted by robotic vehicles. If you think of it as the latter, then we can get a lot of bang for our bucks. Some of the robotic missions that have been sent out are spectacularly successful. In fact, almost everything that we know about the solar system that we didn't learn from Earth-based telescopes, we learned from robotic vehicles, not from people digging around on the moon for stuff. But that's a very hard sell to NASA, that it's really people who are doing the exploring on Earth using robotic assistance. Now, in expert systems, expert systems have been introduced in thousands of contexts, and we do indeed notice that the workers in the field both resent and resist bringing in the expertise of someone else, namely some self-designated expert, to to do the reasoning on some problems. One of the ways that doctors are particularly prone to this. They do not, it's been very hard to gain acceptance of expert systems in medicine. But one of the things you have to do is to allow the expert system to explain its line of reasoning to the end user. And so, in fact, since all expert systems are put together that way, some people have even defined an expert system as a computer program that can explain its reasoning to someone else, which is not the way we thought of it at the outset. We thought of that, the explaining, as just a way of bringing the human into the loop, so to speak. And once that, no doctor is going to accept advice from an expert system unless the expert system can explain what it's doing.
Maybe an expert system can go before the court, explain its reasoning. You know, go ahead, Steve.
I'm dying to know how the Air Force made this cultural change. In World War II, bomber missions, every time there's a mission, they painted it on their bombers. And the fighters, if they had a kill, they would paint it on their fighter. What do they paint on the joysticks?
I don't know. One of the strange things about the Air Force piloting these missions, it takes place in Nevada. And it could take place in an ordinary room that looks like your office with computer terminals and joysticks and all that. It doesn't. It takes place in a room that looks just like the inside of a cockpit, with people arrayed and instruments arrayed just as if it were a cockpit. But of course it's not a cockpit.
Well, you know,
I still think it's a great thing to have a man on the moon. I'm sorry.
Now, why so?
Well, I think there's not as much excitement in having a drone on the moon. It's humanity extending its reach into the universe. I think that's exciting, and I think that is adventuresome. Now, it may not bring as much knowledge. That was your point. But there's things in the world besides knowledge. There's adventuresome, there's ambition, there's the desire for humans to go where they've never gone before. And that's not worth nothing.
Well, in fact, you know, a Rensselaer alumnus and former president of the Institute, by the way, managed the mission that landed a man on the moon. And the U.S. benefited exponentially from the space race because of the focus that it had on educating young people and the inspiration it did provide in encouraging young people to pursue careers in science and engineering. But, you know, NASA is in a state of flux. And Bart, I know you've thought a little about this, about, you know, what's going to happen, you know, with the U.S. and space exploration going forward. You know, with the docking this morning of the SpaceX Dragon to the International Space Station, we entered a new space era. You know, and this was an example of public-private partnership, which people have argued is kind of the new pathway forward. You have a point of view about that? And then, Steve, I'd like to hear from you on that.
Well, first, let me follow up on this interesting conversation. I guess you can see this is, you sort of got the science wing and the legal wing.
We're on the human side over here.
Well, I'm an expert in the middle.
Clearly, robotics is, again, as you say, a more efficient way. I think you're going to see, and even the deep exploration of space, you're going to have more robotics because of the, you know, just the length of time there. But it is not as sexy. And for many of the non-pure scientists, that's what inspires. It's the human space flight. So somehow we have to balance that, and it's difficult because we simply don't have enough money to go around, which goes back to your earlier question. NASA for a long time continued to be asked to do more and more and more, but wasn't given the resources to do it. So it would lengthen it, it would start and stop, and it pretty much lost its way. I think there was a time that we needed a timeout. Whether this is right or wrong, where we are now is you're going to see a new phase of NASA, and that is sort of low Earth orbit, as demonstrated by today. You're going to see more of a private sector effort there, which, interestingly, it is combining some entrepreneurs that can make quick decisions with some of the incumbents that had, their technology. So I think it's coming along pretty well. There's a real question, though, about taking it from cargo to humans. Hopefully that can happen. But when you go beyond that, then there is going to be a role for NASA. It's going to be a much larger investment, and it's going to be a much more robotic type approach. So somewhere the American people and federal government have to match the money and the mission, and we haven't quite got that right yet.
Steve?
Well, I used to have these discussions with a very close friend, housemate of mine for many years about the science exploration versus the human part of this. And there's no denying that the majority of the public reacts more to the human aspect. When men and women go onto the moon, that's one thing. If you send a Mars lander, rovers are fabulously successful, the scientists get really excited about this. But the rest of the public doesn't quite capture that. It's just like the fighter pilot, and the heroic efforts of a fighter pilot still seem to capture the imagination of the public more than the highly skilled drone pilot sitting wherever they sit and painting their decals wherever they paint them. So there is that human element. But I would also have to say that, President made a decision, do we spend a lot to put another set of men and women on the moon? There's this high cost, and if you do it 30 years after, it's 1969, is it, the cost benefit is not quite. So the next frontier would be Mars. Now, the only trouble with Mars is we can get them there, we can't get them back. And on the way there, they get a lethal dose of radiation. So there are these technical hurdles that we haven't figured out. And so, yes, it would capture the world imagination if we can put people on Mars and they can walk around. And maybe they're not going to discover as much as the Martian land rovers. But we have this, there are technical limitations, and that next part is still one where we don't know. We don't know how to protect the astronauts from the radiation dosage. And we still can't figure out how to get them back. And it was pointed out to me that many, many people would volunteer for the one-way trip.
One-way trip.
And then other wiser heads in the government said, yeah, but even if they volunteer, I don't think it would be responsible if the government would allow them to do this. But and the cost is, it's not even a matter of cost. We don't even have the solutions. And so we have to work through those things. But, I recognize on that side, and partly on this side, that we all recognize, scientists are human beings too,
Let me quickly add that the benefit to the country and to humankind is not getting that person to Mars or that robot to Mars. It'll be all of the technological discoveries and the breakthroughs that we have to do and find to get there. That's where the real benefit's going to be.
Right, but I think in the end, the scientists are going to focus on the science and how do we do that in the best possible way. But what is motivating, and Justice Scalia spoke to this, is when the human is part of that, because that seems to be inspirational. But let me go back a little bit about the law and the court. Now, we've been talking about disruptive technologies and their impact, but Justice Scalia, court cases themselves can have disruptive impact, and that's certainly been the consequence of more recent celebrated cases like Bush v. Gore, Citizens United, et cetera. But what I'd like to talk to you about for a moment, and it may be one that I'm told that you don't always like to talk about, but I have to talk to you about it. Because I want to talk to you about a case.
I have life tenure. I really don't have to talk about anything.
Oh, but you're such a nice man. I'm sure you will. Because I want to talk about a case that did have a particularly profound and, I dare say, disruptive impact on my life and on the lives of many others. And that is the Brown v. Board of Education decision, which desegregated the public schools. And in conjunction with the space race, the Brown decision opened educational opportunities that otherwise would not have been available certainly to me and to others like me. And it set me on a path that, in fact, has led me here today with you. And I know that you have spoken to this before, so I would ask you to please discuss where you feel today you would have come down on the Brown decision, and does it square with your originalist philosophy?
Yes, well, Brown is often raised in opposition to the practice of interpreting the Constitution to say what it was understood to mean when it was adopted. Indeed, I call it waving the bloody red shirt of Brown versus Board of Education. There are two answers that those of us who are originalists have. The first one is that Brown was an originalist decision. I mean, an originalist begins with the text. You're dealing here with the text of the 13th and 14th Amendments, which prohibit discrimination on the basis of race. They say, you know, how that could possibly have produced Plessy versus Ferguson, which was a case decided in the 1898, I guess it was, in which Louisiana had a law requiring black people to ride in a separate rail car. And the court approved that. I think that was a big mistake, and I would not have been with the court. I would have been with Justice Harlan's dissent. I think Harlan was being an originalist. He looked at the text and he said, it's simply not the provision of equal protection of the law when you require the race for whom these provisions existed to ride in a separate car. So I think I would have been with the majority in Brown. But frankly, that's that's the least important answer.
What's the most important?
The most important answer is I will stipulate that if you ignore originalism and you leave it to the courts to rewrite the Constitution to mean whatever they think it ought to mean today, I will stipulate you can do a lot of really good stuff. Kings could do a lot of really good stuff that a democratic society could never produce. Mm-hmm. Hitler, you know, developed a doggone good automobile, and Mussolini made the trains run on time. It doesn't prove anything. You pick on one instance and you say, look, tyranny produced this. You can say the same thing. Look, you know, judges run amok produced this good thing. I'll stipulate that can happen, but it doesn't prove that non-originalism is right. You have to ask yourself which approach is most compatible with democracy, and it is certainly not an approach which says that it will be up to judges to decide what the people can vote for and what they can't vote for. It's up to judges to decide what the Constitution means and to overturn the understanding of the Constitution. You know, like the death penalty. You know, there are solid arguments on both sides for that. But the issue is, did the American people ever vote that you cannot institute the death penalty. Did anybody ever vote for that? And the answer is, of course not. When they adopted the Cruel and Unusual Punishments Clause, nobody thought that it prohibited the death penalty. The death penalty was the only penalty for a felony. Now, should it be up to judges to reinterpret the Eighth Amendment now and say, oh, although the American people didn't abolish the death penalty, we think we should take that issue out of the democratic policy choice, and we will decide you cannot have the death penalty. If you think that's compatible with democracy, then you shouldn't be an originalist. But you know, I just don't think it is, and it's up to the people. Some states have the death penalty, some don't. The Constitution says nothing about it. It permits it, but does not require it. It permits it, but does not forbid it. So,
Well, let's talk for a moment then about originalism in this sense. You've spoken to, amendments to the United States Constitution, which by definition are not, means that they have amended the document as originally, the document has been amended as originally written. And of course, amendments by definition are hard to do, although I've did a little bit of study, and there's some interesting ways that in theory, amendments to the Constitution could be made. So are you saying that the originalist view of amendments to the Constitution incorporates them as being part of original intent?
oh, of course. I mean, you interpret the amendments according to what the people understood them to mean, just as you interpret the original. For example, the Equal Protection Clause, which was adopted after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment. Now, does the Equal Protection Clause guarantee women the vote? You know, as an abstract matter, you might say equal protection of the laws. What does it mean? It could mean anything. It could mean you need unisex toilets in all public buildings, you know. Does it mean that it could mean you have to draft women if you draft? Does it mean? Of course it doesn't mean those. Nobody ever thought it meant those things. And it's the same thing with the issue of the franchise. Nobody thought that you could not discriminate on in the franchise, not only on the basis of sex, but in those days on the basis of property ownership, on the basis of literacy. All of that was considered perfectly okay. So the American people never voted to take that out of the arena of democratic choice. And so that amendment I would interpret like the rest of the Constitution. What did it mean to the society that adopted it? Did they take anything away from the future society's ability to choose? And on that issue, I, as on many others, I find not.
Well, so let me make sure I'm understanding. So amendments to the Constitution square with the originalist perspective of the Constitution.
Yeah, because the Constitution has an amendment provision,
okay,
which does not read, you know, it shall be amended as the judges decide.
Right.
It reads
how it should be.
There's a process to amend it.
And so, in fact, the fact that the Constitution as originally written provided for amendments, then by definition, amendments done in accord with that, how things were laid out, are valid parts.
Absolutely, 100%.
Okay.
I'm all for those. And by the way, if I was going to make any change in the Constitution, it'd probably be in the amendment provision, which is...
Okay, let's...
Not to eliminate it, but... No, I figured it out once, and things have changed so much that if you take a bare minimum of the votes in the smallest states, something like 2% of the population can prevent a constitutional amendment. That's too much, and it was not that extreme, you know, when it was applied in the first place, when there were only 13 states, and the divergence in the size of the smallest and the largest was not what it is now between Rhode Island and California. So, yeah, we might change the amendment provision to make amendment easier.
Please.
Just real quickly, we could have a 2-week seminar on originalist philosophy. But I'd like to get back to your originalist comment, and that was about the disruptive aspect of the Supreme Court.
Yes.
And somewhat in context of what we were talking about earlier, whether it's Morrill versus Madison, Board of Education versus Brown. I think more recently, if you look at Citizens United, and without getting into the merits of it, but someone who has been on the ballot for 13 times, I think we're going to look back and we're going to see that Citizens United, by virtue of allowing unlimited amounts of money, almost in many cases unanimous, I mean not unanimously, but unanimously, without the term anonymously, with unlimited amounts of money anonymously put into the electoral system.
Doesn't have to be anonymous.
It doesn't have to, but it allows it to be anonymous.
No, it doesn't. Oh, it permits it, but if the people don't want it to be anonymous, it doesn't have to be.
Oh, no, right. If they want to volunteer that they're giving a few $1 million to beat something, that's fine. But they don't have to.
That's right. Just as they did not have to prohibit corporations.
I'm not getting into the merits. I'm just saying the facts are that it allows unlimited amounts of dollars to be spent without attribution. It can be spent other ways, but that way. I think we're going to look back on that, again, not with the merits or anything. We're going to look back on that as something that is enormously disruptive.
Require.
Well, I'm not getting into the merits. I'm just saying, the question of being.
Of course, you're getting into the merits.
I'm saying,
of course, you're getting into the merits.
In terms of the question of being disruptive, this is an example of something that I think is going to polarize even more so the political system now. And what you'll find, I think, is that it will be changed. There will be some type of corruption that will be greater than Watergate, that will have the same kind of impact, whether through the amendment process or whatever. But again, I'm just talking about what's constitutional is what the Supreme Court says is constitutional. So you said this is constitutional. So I mean, that's not without question. I'm just talking about the disruptive aspect of the Supreme Court.
But disruption means changing what was there before. The situation that existed and that was overruled by Citizens United had been created 10 years earlier. It overruled a case that was 10 years old, and a case which itself was very disruptive. Everybody had understood Buckley versus Vallejo, which was way back in the I guess the 60s, the early 60s. Everybody assumed Buckley versus Vallejo was the law. And the case which Citizens United overruled kicked over that apple cart. So if you want to talk about disruption, we were undoing a disruption that had occurred 8 or 10 years earlier. I mean, that's the reality of it. Everybody assumed after Buckley that there were no limitations upon independent expenditures, whoever made them, individual, corporation. And on the merits, Citizens United, if you look at the legislative history, it was a reaction against attack ads. Its whole purpose was to make it impossible to run attack ads. And if you think you're likely to get a fair electoral system by letting the incumbents draw up the rules, you're crazy.
Well, as having a lot of those attack ads run against me, I don't think it's unreasonable for someone to have to identify themselves if they feel about that. But again, that's not to the merits. It's just
Citizens United says nothing about that. Nothing about that.
I tell you what, I think we'll go to some easy questions. But we shall return. You know, here at Rensselaer, we are home to one of the most powerful university-based supercomputers, and we're on a path to expand its power to the petascale. And so, Steve Chu, with you sitting here, and then Dr. Feigenbaum with you sitting here, and Steve, you know, there's this kind of big data versus supercomputing discussion going on now, where people believe that it's all about big data. Others believe if you don't have that computational power, there are things that you can't do. And you've actually spoken eloquently about that, Secretary Chu. Talk a little bit about that.
I'll be very quick. I think if you look at how we gather data, both scientific data, data over the internet, lots of things, data, this is growing by leaps and bounds. And even just from a strictly scientific point of view, if you look at the telescopes, the accelerators, the this, that, huge scads of data will be coming in. But the flip side of that is you also need to also grow commonly the calculational capability, because just archiving scads of data is really not going to do anything. And so there's a natural thing where you know that the data is coming in, you want to be able to analyze and massage it. So you have to grow them together. You can't say, oh, well, we're going to enter a period of big data and fund that and let the other thing lie fallow for a little while, because then you just get essentially electronic cloud in the sky warehouses where it just sits. And so I think of the people who've thought very deeply about this and are in the area of high performance computing data feel that you just want to grow it together naturally rather than to single out one aspect of it and say, this is where we want to go. But
Dr. Feigenbaum, and what does this portend for artificial intelligence research?
I agree completely with what you said. When you talk about supercomputers, some people think you're talking about the extrapolation of what we had in the past to bigger and faster and faster and faster and faster. So they talk about petaflops and exaflops and all of that. But you can also, there's another kind of supercomputing that's out there that people just don't realize. It's called warehouse computing. It's gigantic warehouses full of millions of networked computers, such as Google uses and Microsoft uses, and they station them on the Columbia River where the electric power is cheap. Now, that kind of computing is what you need to do this processing of vast amounts of data. What people also don't understand is the progress that's been made in the availability of great algorithms to exploit the pattern recognition from that data. It started about 1980 as a sort of a joint venture between statisticians and the artificial intelligence community, sometimes called knowledge discovery and data, otherwise sometimes called machine learning technology. And it's a very powerful technology, and it needs these highly parallel and very fast supercomputers, which we have. Just wanted to make one last comment, though, about the impact on artificial intelligence research. In my earlier remarks about artificial intelligence, I mentioned there is a one-dimensional spectrum that AI people talk about called the knowledge versus search spectrum. And almost all the work that's been done has been concentrated at the knowledge end of the spectrum because it's so powerful. There was one data point that I mentioned that wasn't in that group, and that was where a very, very fast machine, specially designed in its time, which was 1996, 7, and 8, beat the world's chess champion at chess. And he was not just the chess champion, he was generally thought to be the greatest chess player who ever lived. He's still alive, Garry Kasparov. And it did it by processing, looking at about 10 to the 8th or 10 to the 9th paths, as opposed to the chess champion who was looking at, generously speaking, 10 to the 3rd or 10 to the 4th. So we might be able to find brilliant moves in the world of domains that we consider by going deeper in the search space. And we just haven't done enough experiments with that yet. And I'm trying to convince my colleagues that the edge of where we explore might be the edge of creativity. If you look at what the chess people wrote in the chess magazines after that game in which Deep Blue did a spectacular move and sort of shook Kasparov, these chess magazines were raving about the computer's move. And this was something new to mankind. That move had never been explored before. No one had ever thought of it. And there have been other instances in the history of artificial intelligence similar to that, all of which were done by not supercomputers. So let's try doing them with supercomputers.
Steve Sasson, what do you say about this? And you know, there's a subtlety having to do with data and in what form, including data that comes from images. What's your view of the big data computing
This has been a fascinating
issue?
conversation because over the last 30 years, the technology involved with personal photography has evolved. We first started off, you know, electronic photography was very memory intensive, so cameras can't hold many images. And then that technology got solved, and problems got solved, and we introduced new problems, right? Pretty soon it's very cheap to store it, but how do you find these pictures, right? Now you've got semantic algorithms that basically can look at pictures and identify people in the pictures and all the rest of this stuff. So this keeps going on and on and on, and I agree with everything that's been said, but I may offer a question to the legal wing, okay? That's the integrity of the data. You know, I know when we get into court cases, a photograph is offered. Is that photograph real? Does that photograph represent reality of the instant it was captured? It's so easily manipulated. It's so easily altered.
It's true.
You know, when is reality being offered by this data? So the integrity of the data now, I think, is an issue, probably for archivists, but I also think from a legal point of view, it's a challenge.
Justice Scalia?
Yeah, well, this is either above or below my pay grade. I'm not sure. I'm not sure which one it is. But it's a question of evidence, and I'm sure different states probably have different rules as to what has to be established in order to assure the authenticity of the picture. But it's obviously a problem, and maybe sometimes you can't really tell whether it's been altered or not. I'm sure that's a problem.
Back when I was doing dog bite cases and things like that back in Murfreesboro, again, when you put evidence in like that, you have to validate it. Who took the picture? What were the circumstances? So it would be more and more. But just to put a image there would not be enough. But it certainly does complicate things.
There may be a technical solution to this, and that is if you think about the imaging and you write it on the memory card in the camera, you can have a pretty small tag that identifies that. And if you change any bit from that, you know, because it's like a lot of things, you know, it goes from file to file to file to file, and the archiving, because data is, we're able to store all this. You actually see all the versions. You see all 50 versions of a manuscript that you prepare for a legal brief or a scientific paper.
That's right.
And you can capture on the memory card a little thing that says, it's like a digital signature.
Right, the metadata
Right.
that goes with it.
Right.
Maybe I'm being more devious. I'm thinking of the mischief that can be done.
No, but I think, though, that I would agree with this, Steve. I think this whole question about the tagging of the data and having that be part of the original capture.
Yes.
The other side of
is an
that, though, was
important
DNA
point.
and other types of, if you want to say, science-enhanced evidence that we didn't have before.
Right.
So it goes both ways.
Right, and listen, you want to jump on originalism. Here's a problem, and you scientists would be especially interested in all these DNA tests. They are done sometimes by a police lab, very often by an independent lab. They take, the sperm, whatever it is, and they send it off to the lab. They get the report that says, you know, this is what the DNA was, and these are the chances that it was from this individual and whatnot. We have in the federal Constitution a thing called the Confrontation Clause, which excludes hearsay evidence. When somebody comes in, he can't come into the court and say, well, I didn't see the murder myself, but Joe told me that he did it. No, you can't do that. That's hearsay. You have the right to confront the person who is giving the testimony. Now, what do you do with these technicians? Are you going to have to bring the technicians in? And we've held that that's what the Confrontation Clause requires, at least somebody who is running the operation, where you just can't have somebody say, we sent it off to the lab and the lab came back with this report. Some of those labs are not terribly reliable.
Well, there are actually provisions on that in criminal cases and also drug testing for athletes, that there are very special procedures to try to guarantee the integrity, because people realize the real monkey business could be in the handling of the stuff and the contamination of the samples, all those other things. Right. And so the laws are getting refined to make sure that you have to document that, you know, it's not perfect, but
no, it isn't perfect,
but that's where it's going.
Yeah.
That's a real cross-section of science and
Right.
law, and it remains to be worked out how well that's going to.
Now, we said we would take a couple of questions from the audience. And so if there are a couple of people who wish to tweet in a question, we would be happy to have it. But here's one that had come in a little earlier, and it's for you, Justice Scalia.
See, everybody knows about law.
No?
Not everybody knows about science, you know? If you don't know about it, you're inclined to say, hey, better not ask a question.
I have an opinion.
Well, I think the reason we have all of you here is because you represent that spectrum that affects people's lives across the board. So here's the question. How do you anticipate internet privacy considerations might be addressed by the Supreme Court in the short and long term? And do you see it requiring statutory reform? Because there's only, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986 is the only federal statute to date, at least according to this questioner.
You're asking the wrong guy. Being an originalist, my answer is, of course, it has to be done by statute, because the Constitution does not have any generalized protection of privacy. It has a very specific guarantee that people shall be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. And the first time my court was confronted with wiretapping, for example, it held, there are a lot of state laws against it, but they held it did not violate the Fourth Amendment to wiretap, because it did not intrude upon persons, houses, papers, or effects. It was conversations. We overruled that case about 10 years later. So now there is, I don't know what it is, some generalized right of privacy. But I doubt very much whether we're going to do the very fine tuning that would be necessary to protect all of the new technologies. I think it'll have to be Congress.
Plus, it's a little unfair to ask to prejudge a case, too. I mean, it's a little unfair to ask of you to have to prejudge a case.
Well, no, try not to.
So you see, we have a little bipartisanship.
No, but listen, I want to get this in before we close down. It's not that I don't know anything about it. I actually, the year that I taught at Stanford Law School, my landlord was Joshua Lederberg. I lived in his house.
So I know exactly the house.
Do you really? In Palo Alto.
It was wiretapped.
Another member of Rising Above the Gathering Storm.
Well, we're not seeing other tweets come in.
Could I just add to?
Sure, of course.
I'm not a lawyer, but I just wanted to add some complexity to what you two were saying. We have a big issue coming up probably hasn't hit your court yet, maybe won't for a while, but it's the issue of, let me phrase it this way, it's privacy versus security. And when I say security, I mean national security.
Yes.
We are really at the edge now with regard to invasions from the internet, malware of all kinds, very severe. And if you haven't heard of the Stuxnet invasion of industrial processes where somebody, probably Americans and Israelis working together, sabotaged centrifuges in Iran, that was spectacularly better than any other attack that has ever been done. We're really at the frontier, and the government wants some stronger ways of looking at those bits and what they mean as they flow around the internet, and privacy advocates don't want the government to look at those bits and know what they mean. And this is a real tension between our security and our privacy.
Really is. Yeah. Not my problem, it's his problem.
Which is correct.
So, there's a friend of Justice Scalia's in the audience, and he happens to be the chairman of our Board of Trustees, Judge the Honorable Arthur Gallarza. And Art, I'm going to let you ask the last question here.
Arthur, you owe me. It took me 5 hours to get here. And my bag still has not arrived.
It's not going to let you off the hook.
Okay.
The next time we go fishing, I'll let you catch the biggest fish. Justice Scalia, one of the aspects of the Constitution is the 17th Amendment, which was adopted in 1913. You have been known to point out that that amendment essentially changed the political landscape of this great country. Would you explain your position regarding that 17th Amendment, which allowed for senators to be elected by popular vote in each state instead of the legislatures?
Yeah, well,
That's a softball.
yeah, it is a softball. Thank you. It's, you know, when I was up for confirmation, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee was Strom Thurmond. And the first question he gave me says, Judge Scalia, what do you think of judicial activism? I said, Senator, let me have that one. I'm ready for it. You know, that was a softball. There's a prologue. Here's the prologue. Most Americans, if you ask them, you know, why are we the freest society in the world, have been for 200 years, which is true, they would probably say freedom of speech, freedom of the press, no unreasonable searches and seizures, no quartering of troops in homes, right to keep and bear, the provisions of the Bill of Rights. But that is so wrong. Every tin horn dictator in the world today has a Bill of Rights. Every banana republic has a Bill of Rights. The former evil empire, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, had a much better Bill of Rights than ours. The key to our freedom has not been the Bill of Rights. I mean, I'm glad we have it, but what makes it live, what makes it something other than words on papers, is the real Constitution. If you think of the word Constitution, it means structure, the structure of our government. And if you have a structure that permits the centralization of power, you can kiss the Bill of Rights goodbye. It doesn't matter what it says, you can ignore it. That's what most of the world does. You wouldn't want to live in most of the countries of the world that have Bills of Rights. Now, one of those features, there are so many different features of our system. I mean, there are very few countries that have a genuine bicameral legislature. Oh yeah, England has a House of Lords. The House of Lords can't do anything. It can just make the Commons pass it a second time. There are very few countries of the world, none of the parliamentary countries, in which the chief executive is not the tool of the legislature. There's never any disagreement between the prime minister and the parliament in Italy, in France, in England. When there's a disagreement, they kick him out. He's the creature of the parliament. They have a no confidence vote, they have a re-election, and they get a new prime minister who is the tool of the parliament. That's what makes us different. We have the power, you know, distributed. A separately elected president And in most of the countries in the world, you cannot be a cabinet secretary. Mr. Chu here could not serve as a cabinet secretary unless he had been elected to the parliament, to Congress. We're just the opposite. Not only do you not have to have been elected, but it's forbidden. He's not permitted to be elected to Congress if he wants to serve in any post in the executive branch. So it's all of these features. One of those features that disperses the power is, of course, federalism, where, we're a government of enumerated powers, and most of the stuff is out there in the states. Most of the laws you live under are not federal laws, even as big as the federal government's gotten. It's interstitial. You can murder somebody anywhere in the country, and if you do it right, you have not violated a federal law. Don't use a machine gun, and don't kill me. But if you're careful, all basic criminal law is state law, basic contract law is basic tort law, all family law, it's all state stuff. Now, who protected the states in our structure? People would say, the Supreme Court would make sure that the Supreme Court, that Congress would not go beyond its. What, are you kidding? I'm a Fed. I'm nominated by a federal president, confirmed by a federal Senate. I'm not going to protect the states against the feds. And if I did, they'd, expand the number of justices on the court and appoint people who will do what the Senate wants and what the president wants. Now, the protection for the states in the original Constitution was the fact that the state governments owned the Senate. They owned the Senate. Nothing could get through the Senate without the approval of senators who were elected by the state legislatures. What a different system. So whenever the federal government was getting into areas that the states didn't like, they would just call up their senator and say, you vote for that one and you're out of there. That all changed in 1913 with the 17th Amendment, and you can trace, people wring their hands about states' rights, states' rights. Forget about it, it's gone. The rest of the 20th century was a constant increase in the activities of the federal government and constant erosion of so-called states' rights. And don't stop wringing your hands about it. We still have very much a federal republic, but it is a federal republic at sufferance. Anything that Congress really, really wants to do, it can achieve. It can drive it through one way or another. The only structural protection was what Judge Gallarza pointed out, taken away by the 17th Amendment. In a fit of populism, Seemed like a good idea. And there was a lot of corruption in the days when the legislature would select the senators. But there's worse things in the world than a decent amount of corruption.
Well, with that,
Yeah.
at the Rensselaer Commencement tomorrow, we will confer honorary degrees on the Honorable Antonin Scalia, Associate Justice, Supreme Court of the United States. The Honorable Stephen Chu, United States Secretary of Energy. The Honorable Bart Gordon, former U.S. Congressman from Tennessee. Dr. Edward Feigenbaum, Professor Emeritus at Stanford. And Rensselaer's own Mr. Stephen Sasson, formerly of Kodak. Each of these individuals, as individuals, reflects, and the group collectively reflects the best of what we hope for in our own students. And we also hope that it provides and suggests pathways of how to use their great talents. And they reflect that through their preparation, their perseverance, their ingenuity, their leadership, their commitment to the public good, to the public interest, their passion for the pursuit of excellence, and their answer by example to the Rensselaer motto, why not change the world? Let us thank them for being so generous with their time.
We had a 2-hour delay coming in. Did you? 5, and I think I'd have turned
Thank you.
around.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
I
You did a
enjoyed
good
it.
job.
Thank you. Bart, thank you, sir.